In recent years, Citizen have really upped their game and released watches that have made a big impact on the market. One of the first to do this was the Tsuyosa, which I've looked at the white version of in an earlier video. Citizen didn't rest on their success though, and followed it up with this. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we have another watch from the brand Citizen to look at. If you've watched my channel at all, you'd probably know that my collection and taste is very Seiko heavy. However, like many other collectors out there, Citizen watches have slowly been creeping their way in. The latest to do so for me is sitting right here on the table in front of me. This is the Tsuyosa Small Seconds NK5010-51L. The original Tsuyosa basically took over the budget end of the integrated bracelet market and offered decent specs and finishing with a straightforward everyday design. Where those watches had dials that were very plain yet colourful, on these Small Seconds models, Citizen decided to go all out and add a texture that not many other brands can offer for the price. It is a pattern that many, myself included, would probably most associate with the Grand Seiko Whirlpool, and while I don't have that to compare it to, I do have its big brown brother, the SBGR 311, so we can see just how similar they are and how close Citizen got to pulling off the same look. Before we get to that though, let's have a look at the watch as a whole first, and start right where it matters most, the price. Here in Australia, these have an official retail price of 850 Australian dollars and 595 US dollars. That goes for all three of the currently available colorways, those being this brilliant blue, a sandy brown, and a cool grey which comes on a leather strap rather than a bracelet. At that price, they might face some stiffer competition, but at least here I've seen them going for under 400 Australian dollars, or closer to 250 US dollars when on sale, with a 5-year warranty. At that price, they're a much more compelling proposition in terms of the specs, design, and quality that you're receiving for the money. So, what do you actually receive when you buy this watch? Let's take a closer look and start off with the clear star of the show here. There are no two ways about it. This watch is all about that dial and the texture. While you're not getting anything like hand-engraved guilloche at this price point, you are more or less getting the look. The dial surface features an intricate geometric spiraling pattern that grows right out from the center of the dial. Something that gets said a lot about Seiko's Presage dials is they look like they belong on much more expensive watches. Well, the same can absolutely be said for this Tsuyosa Small Seconds. It's detailed, precise, and even with all those angled surfaces and shapes on the dial, still maintains some subtlety at arm's length. The fact that the texture is very consistent across the whole dial also helps it to not look too attention-grabby in my opinion. This one I have here is of course the blue one, and this particular shade of blue is quite bright and vibrant. Though I wouldn't call it aqua, it is something more like a sea blue. There is a tiny amount of a greenish tint to it, and I do really like that. It separates itself out from a lot of other blue watches you see. There's more to the dial than just that though. Here, Citizen have followed their winning formula from the original Tsuyosa, with a simple, legible dial featuring rectangular lume-filled battens for the hour markers. These are applied with polished surrounds, and both the 12 and 6 receive double KitKat markers to differentiate them from the others. The 6 have been cut a bit short here to make way for the subdial, but we'll come back to that soon. Outside of those hour markers is a simple minute track printed in white. On each 5 minutes is a small square of white, which, just like the original version, is actually loomed, so it gives a bit of extra detail once the light goes out. The other printing on the dial takes the form of the Citizen logo and the word automatic above the pinion. I don't mind the 2 lines of text here at all, but just like on the previous version I looked at, I can't help but think that the dial would have looked more balanced if the text was a bit further down, closer to the center, between the bottom of the hour marker and the pinion. Now, we can come back to the Small Seconds subdial, the other differentiator between this and the original Tsuyosa. Here Citizen went with a contrasting silver color to help it stand out against the rest of the dial. This section here has also been textured in a different way, with concentric circles. These are so small that generally you can't see them with the naked eye. It's also been kept simple, with just a minute track in black, and some nice variation in size of the markers for the hours. Another very fine detail that helps this subdial to pop is a thin line of polish that separates the subdial from the main dial, and catches the light just enough to frame it. Down here at the Small Seconds, Citizen have used a hand that matches the colour of the dial pretty much perfectly. On the grey dial, this hand is black, and on the sandy brown version, it's orange, which does stand out a little more. I don't mind this choice to use the same colour or a similar colour to the dial here. It might even have been tempting to use a complementary colour or accent colour, like orange here, and in theory that would work well with the blue dial, but if you had that in addition to the overall texture, it would be a bit much. The main hands are also fairly simple, and carry over from the original model. Rectangular batten hands with a bevel down the middle, fully polished and loomed. As a whole, I'd say they're pretty well balanced and give a good amount of legibility when reading the time. The other part of the watch that helps with reading the time is the crystal, which has received some anti-reflective coating. It is sapphire rather than mineral crystal, which is a selling point of the watch over many other similarly priced Seikos. It's dead flat, sits flush with the bezel, and does fairly well for itself in bright light thanks to the coating on the underside. Since we've talked about it already, let's take a look at the lume once the lights go out. It's not anything spectacular that will blow you away, but at the same time, it's enough to give you a read of the time fairly easily after dark. The lume is not on the same level as something like a dive watch, but I don't think anyone is expecting it to be either. That all sounds so good so far, but what about the dimensions? They can make or break a watch. Citizen went with some pretty standard crowd-pleasing sizes on this one. They already had the blueprint from the original version, and so it has the same 40mm case size. This is combined with 11.9mm in height, which is not bad at all. Lug to lug is a bit trickier to measure, coming in at 44.9mm, if you just measure the case itself. But male end links extend this out to 49.8mm. Because it is an integrated bracelet design, lug width is also a lot less relevant. There are some aftermarket straps I've seen available for this watch, and those will be 13mm wide to fit the case, before flaring out to 22 like this bracelet does for that first link. By the time it gets to the clasp, it's tapered down ever so slightly to 20mm. Numbers only tell half the story though. The design of a case can change the way a watch wears completely. On this one, we have a slim polished bezel up front surrounding the dial. It has been set atop a flat vertically brushed case that comes to squared off ends that angle downwards and continue that vertical brushing. The way the case is shaped doesn't add much to the shoulders, where traditional lugs would be, and helps the watch to wear a bit more true to the 40mm size. That top surface is broken up by a polished chamfer that runs the length of the case from tip to tip, and transitions into sides that have also been polished. Looking from the side here we can see a few things. First is how the case angles down to help it conform to the wrist, but also how those male end links extend it past the end of the case itself. The other thing we can see here is the technique Citizen used on this Tsuyosa to make the case feel thinner than it already is. The side of the case has been heavily undercut so that the actual side of the case itself is not very thick. By angling in underneath and meeting the case back at an angle, the visual height of the watch is significantly reduced. Though, at 11.9mm, it wasn't all that thick to begin with. Turning to the other side, and we get a look at a relatively small recessed crown at a little past 4 o'clock. It is polished and unsigned, which doesn't really bother me at all, but is something that is important to a lot of other people. What does bother me about this crown though, is how being recessed makes it a bit harder to wind the movement. It does have a cutout on the underside to give you more access, but is still more difficult than it needs to be if you ask me. Speaking of winding the movement, this watch houses a Miyota 8322A movement. It offers hacking and hand winding, as well as that small seconds complication we saw on the front. It is a no-date movement, so the crown does not have a ghost date position when you're operating it. It can be seen through the display case back on the watch, which offers a view of the skeletonized, signed rotor, and a bit of decoration on the movement itself. Much like Seiko's NH series of movements, the 8 and 9000 series of movements from Miyota, who are owned by Citizen, are reliable and robust movements that should provide trouble-free operation for years to come. Back here, we can also see in the specs around the caseback that the watch has just 5 bar or 50 meters of water resistance. Not as reassuring as 100 meters would have been, but better than being just splash resistant. One last thing to cover before getting it on wrist is the bracelet. Like I said earlier, it starts off at 22mm when it leaves the case, and tapers down to 20 at the clasp. It's made up of 3-piece links, with a much more prominent polished mid-link. Generally, I don't really like polished mid-links, but somehow this one manages to pull it off. Another thing to note, which is more easily visible from the back, is that there are some pretty big gaps between each link. I don't know if it was for breathability or comfort, but it isn't something noticeable when on wrist. The links themselves are made up from a semicircular profile, with rounded tops and a flat underside. The look is very reminiscent of something like a President bracelet from Rolex. Finally, we come to the clasp, which is a butterfly clasp, and so doesn't offer any micro adjustment. There are some half links included, which do help to get a slightly better fit. I can understand why Citizen chose to use a butterfly clasp here, so as not to break up the look of the bracelet, and I've managed to get it to fit pretty well on my wrist. There is, however, no branding or signature on the clasp, like the crown, but that doesn't bother me, though it might bother you. Okay, we've covered the watch in detail, so now let's see how it looks on my wrist. My wrist is probably a hair under 7 inches or 18 centimeters, and I think it looks a good size for me. Turning my wrist, we get to see that dial really catch the light and come to life, as well as all the polishing down the bracelet. One thing I will say is that while it may not look it, it does feel a bit long thanks to the male end links. It could just be because I've been wearing a lot of smaller watches recently, but I can't help but think that a couple of millimeters being shaved off would have made the watch wear just about perfectly. Citizen has updated the 3-hand version in a 37mm case size, so I really hope they do the same with this version too. I don't have any alternate straps to show you this on today because it is an integrated bracelet, but I think it looks right at home and wouldn't want to change it out for a strap anyway. So, clearly it's a nice looking, well designed and decently spec'd watch for the money, especially when it's on sale. For those reasons and more, this watch was and still is a very popular model for the brand, but that doesn't mean there aren't improvements that could be made in my opinion. I've mentioned a few as we've gone along in this review. First up, I'd like to see a bit more than 50 meters of water resistance that we currently get, just for peace of mind. I also mentioned I'd like to see a couple of millimeters shaved off the case side, or at the very least, the lug to lug with those male end links. A bit more taper on the bracelet also wouldn't go astray, and the last thing I'd like to say about this one relates to the dial. Yes, it is a very nice texture and is well executed. However, there is something about either the material or the way it's finished that I don't like. When it catches the light from some angles, the dial looks more like a sunburst blue, and the texture takes on a more vibrant blue color. Other times, the texture looks white as it reflects the light. To me, this looks a bit cheap and almost plasticky, unfortunately. This becomes even more apparent when we bring in the earlier promised and long-awaited Grand Seiko cookie for comparison. Now of course, the prices are not comparable at all, and the level of finishing isn't either, but here looking at the two, you should be able to see what I mean about the white. The dial on the Grand Seiko reacts like a typical sunburst dial would when the light hits it, changing from a rich dark brown to a vibrant lighter brown. The edges of the texture don't appear white like they do on the Citizen. The detail on the texture of the Grand Seiko is also very, very crisp, which you'd certainly hope so for the price. But looking side by side, the Citizen is no slouch by any means, and even this close holds up really well. If they were able to finish the dial in a way that got rid of the white reflections, and it looked more like a sunburst, I'd hardly have any complaints at all about the watch. So, this watch isn't a Grand Seiko killer, but I don't think anyone was saying that it was, to be fair. If the texture on the Whirlpool is something you need in your collection, but can't or won't spend the money on to get one, this is absolutely a viable alternative. You get 95% of the look for 5% of the price, and it still comes in a well-made, well-finished package that you can wear every day without it looking out of place anywhere. The hard part is choosing the color which you like the best. What do you think about this watch? Do you prefer the original 3-hand version? Is my complaint about the finish of the dial just being silly? Do you know of other watches that offer unique dials like this one in the same price range? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.